Know this, after David triumphed over Goliath, it wasn't very long that Saul decided to eliminate him, to kill him, to pin him to the wall, so to speak, so as to get rid of the threat to his throne. And David would then go on the run for more than a decade from King Saul. And I don't know if you caught that. We read it in like 3 days as we're reading through our Bibles. We read it in like 15 minutes if you get really ambitious at home and you skip certain words and just get the meaning. But David will, from this point on, be on the run from Saul for over a decade. That's 10 years of tough times and difficult days. I don't know if you understand that. There's 300, did you know? There are 365 days in a year. Multiply that times 10. Thousands of difficult days that David endured. And what we will see today is all the while he trusted God. Now, I know that seems rather churchy and Christian because that's what we should hear on a regular basis, but let that sink in for a moment. In the midst of thousands of difficult days, David continued to trust God, and I would suggest he did so even during circumstances where maybe you and I would do different, where maybe you and I would look for a way out, when maybe you and I would beg for it to stop, when maybe you and I would say, forget praising God, I'm mad because my life is not what I thought it would be right now. In fact, I would wonder, and you don't have to raise your hands, but I just wonder how many people in here might know somebody that's in the midst of some difficult days. I would wonder how many of you, and judging by the nods on the head, there's some. You might know people, maybe in your neighborhood, maybe in your family, maybe in your church. That's here. They're walking through some difficult times, that are struggling right now. Well, I want to encourage you, if you're here and you know somebody that's going through stuff like that, please pay attention, because God may even use this word in your life and then use you to help encourage them to keep hoping and trusting in God. To encourage them, don't give up, because He's the God of help is on the way. I think that's a good preachy phrase. You know what I'm saying? He's the God of help is on the way, and I suggest we're gonna see that. But during first service, it dawned on me, and it's probably true here, that it might not just be true for people that we know, but it might be true for people in here. Is there anybody here that would have the courage to raise their hand and say, I, right now, am in the midst of a difficult time? Keep those hands up for a second, because now I'm going to ask you to do something that's really uncomfortable. Everybody look around. Keep your hands up. Everybody look around. And you remember those hands. You remember those faces. You remember the ones in the moments. Keep your hands up. You remember, because I suggest to you, before this day is over in this place, God may actually bring them back up on your heart, and you're going to have an opportunity to do something for them. Not just go to church, but you're going to have the opportunity to be the church. You can put your hands down. How important is it to trust God with all of our hearts, to lean not on our own understanding, and in all our ways acknowledge Him? Well, according to the testimonies in this room, it's really important, because people are going through tough times. Now, our tough times might be different from what David went through. And so even if we read through every verse of 1 Samuel chapter 21 through 24, if we read through every verse, it would be hard to kind of apply those to our lives, because the circumstances are very different. Yet, if we realize not just what David was going through, but how he felt when he was going through it, we have some inspiration that we can apply directly as a result of what David wrote in the Psalms. Because I'm going to suggest to you, for 1 Samuel chapter 21, 22, 23, and 24, there are corresponding psalms that David wrote when he was going through those moments that we read of in the passages. He actually poured his heart out to God in the midst of these difficult days. And if we read those things and we consider the verses that he wrote in those Psalms, I'm going to tell you right now, we should all walk out of here with a little bit more hope than maybe when we walked in. It's possible. Why? Because he's going to reveal himself as the God who can be trusted, because he's the God of help is on the way. Amen? So 1 Samuel chapter 21. It's interesting. 1 Samuel chapter 21, David goes on the run. He actually goes on the run. He gets out of Jerusalem and he goes on the run. And while he's on the run, I'm just going to overview this for you really quickly, and I'm going to try to keep it in order. While he goes on the run, he ends up at the temple, or the place where they were having sacrifices. And when he ends up there with no food. It speaks of he had to leave in a hurry. Yes? And he shows up, and he's hungry, and he's tired, and he's exhausted. And he asks the priest, do you have any food? And the priest says, no, not that you can eat. All that we have is the bread of the presence. All that we have is the bread that's been sanctified, that is set apart for God. All we have is the bread that reminds us that God is always with us. And legally, according to Leviticus, the Mosaic covenant, nobody was allowed to eat that bread. So David couldn't do it. But there's a moment where the priest says, well, hold on, because David's like, but our life is on the line. We're exhausted and hungry. So there's this interaction between David and the priest where there's an agreement that if David and his men who were with him had kept themselves pure, then he would make an exception and they could have the bread. If you're reading through the Old Testament and you come across that, it's just a story and you read it and you're like, well, that's interesting. However, if you read the rest of the Bible, you'll recognize that there was a moment where Jesus actually refers to this very same story, and he does so as a way to let the religious leaders in his day know that God was more interested in mercy than the mandates of keeping the law. In reality, the law was supposed to point people to their need for God's mercy and grace in Christ. And thousands of years later, Jesus would have a conversation with the religious leaders about this moment where David is given the bread of the presence. And we're supposed to understand it's God's merciful provision and protection. David will then, after getting the bread, he'll then ask the priest, do you have any weapons? And when we read of that, we're supposed to understand his life was on the line. There was a fight on the horizon. And it wasn't a debate like Paul had on Mars Hill with words. It was a fight. David believed that his physical life was in danger. And so he asked, are there any weapons? Because he had to leave in such a haste that he didn't have anything. And the priest says, well, no, the only sword that is here is the one that you brought here after you killed Goliath. I love God. Because God in his providence, when David brought the sword and he left it there, God in his providence, well, that'll come in handy down the road. You just don't know it yet. So he gives him the sword. And he continues on the run to the point to where he flees to Gath. What's important about that is Gath is in the Philistine territory. And David had just killed a famous Philistine. Are you with me? How desperate was David? How troubling were his times? How difficult were his days? He has no choice. There is no safety in his home, and so he has to flee. And the only place that he thinks he might be able to find safety is in the presence of his enemies. Only the enemies hear about it. They hear, the people in Gath, they hear David has showed up. And the king of Gath goes, David, the one that they sing the songs about? Because apparently it was a #1 hit during those days. Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. And I don't think that's the way to sing it. Brent and Emma, I am available for some background vocals at the end of the service. If you can just set a mic aside, that'd be cool. It wouldn't. They hear about David. And David panics because he knows, well, wait a minute. Not only does Saul want to kill me, but for sure the Philistines want to take revenge on me because I killed Goliath. And so he's resigned. We're told in 1 Samuel chapter 21 that David's way out of that was to act like a madman. He pretends to be crazy so that the king of Gath would go, wait, David? This is the guy? I have enough crazy people to deal with. Get him out of here. And according to the sovereign providence of God, even in that moment, David's life is preserved. Here's the interesting thing, just by the way, side note. When we say things like David's life is preserved, we have to understand it wasn't just so we have good Bible stories to teach our little kids in Sunday school, although those are pretty good. When we say that his life is preserved, it's so that we would understand theologically what God was doing to bring about the answer for our sin. What God was doing to bring about the promised Messiah, the one who was promised to come through the line and lineage of David himself. So when we say things like David's life was preserved, we have to understand God was making sure that his plans would come into play. That Jesus would come near, he would live perfectly, die sacrificially, and rise again on the third day miraculously so that anyone and everyone could choose him and find forgiveness for their sin. Make no mistake about it, there's no story in the Old Testament or the New that can be disconnected from the meta-narrative of God's love for humanity. What he was willing to do and how he was willing to preserve those plans to bring it about. So David has to act like a madman. He goes, it says in 1 Samuel chapter 22, David departed from there and he escaped to the cave of Adullam. So he goes to another region. Think that through for a second. Like now he's had to leave what he believed was the only safe place and it wasn't safe for him. So now he has to go where? To open spaces? No. He's resigned to finding refuge and shelter in the dark recesses of a cave. Of a cave. I don't know about you, but in the midst of struggling times and difficult days, have you ever felt like, don't you know that when we're going through tough times, they have a way of making us feel like we're all alone? You know what I mean? You can be in a room full of people and still feel like you're all alone. In fact, there may be somebody here today that's feeling like that. And I got a word for you. You're not alone. You're absolutely not alone. You're not alone. I don't know about you, but man, I've gone through some difficult days and I felt all alone and would have died to have somebody look me in the eye and say, you're not alone. I was a bit of a basket case in those days, and I had a hurt spirit and a bad attitude. And as much as I would have wanted somebody to look me in the eye and say, you're not alone, again and again and again, I would have with an attitude go, well, how do you know? Because I don't know about you, but whenever I wander Walmart in the middle of the night trying to be around people, I still feel alone and hopeless and shameful because I have way too many regrets that I can't figure out how to escape, and I'm all by myself. So how do you know? To which you can respond, well, I've read the Bible. And I highly recommend using that voice. Well, I read the Bible. If it doesn't irritate them, it'll at least disarm them for a moment. What do you mean you've read the Bible? Let me tell you. When David ended up in that dark recesses of the cave by himself, he wasn't alone for very long, because he was then joined by all the misfits and the outcasts of his day, and they found solidarity together, and that group included his family. He wasn't alone. God brought to his presence people that could help. Are you with me? But I love how 1 Samuel chapter 22 describes these people. They're misfits, outlaws, and outcasts. They're not necessarily who we would ask for. Look around, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know about you, but if it were me, I might go to a different church. Ooh, it's hard. You shouldn't, like if you're the preacher at a church, that's something you shouldn't say. But I think you guys are mature enough to know and recognize I tend to be immature and I want to be around cool people. This is not going well. I'm not saying that there are people cooler than you. I'm just saying in my short-sightedness, I often don't know what it is that I need. And what it is that I need, God surrounds me with all the time. Look around, a bunch of misfits and outcasts. And it's okay, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know about you, but I will proudly wear misfit on the back of my jersey at any sporting event. Because at least I'm a misfit that's cared for by the Messiah. So then David is surrounded by people, but he recognizes Saul's not going to stop. And part of the people he's surrounded by is family members, and so he puts them in a safe place, and he continues to run. And in his running, Saul continues to come and try to find him. Saul's late. He's behind. He comes to an area where David was. And he wonders why nobody told him they were there. And in Saul's murderous rage, upon realizing that the priests of Nob didn't turn David into him, in his rage, he decides to murder 85 people on that day because they didn't tell him where David was. 1 Samuel chapter 22. The Bible's not for the faint of heart. It's very difficult. And we are supposed to see a contrast, the difference between trusting God to be who we are and where we're supposed to be, versus Saul, who trusts in himself to protect what it is that he thinks he has that's long gone. When we take matters into our own hands like Saul did, and we're supposed to see the contrast, when we do that, we usually make things worse. At the very least, we destroy friendships and relationships. At worst, we eliminate people from our lives altogether. And that's not the heart of God at all. So Saul orders some of his servants to kill 85 priests of Nob. The servants recognize our king's gone crazy, and they refuse the order. To which Doeg, the Edomite, steps up and says, well, I'll do it. This is the same guy who saw David in Gath. By the way, if you go back and read 1 Samuel chapter 21, 22, 23, 24, you'll see that Doeg was in Gath when David was acting crazy. So Doeg knew where he was and had reported him to the king. So Doeg says, I'll do it. 85 people are killed. 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 20, it says, but one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. And David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me. Do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks yours as well. With me you shall be in safekeeping. I read those verses to you so that we want to understand that even in the midst of a horrific tragedy that on one level David felt somewhat responsible for, he still trusted that God was going to keep him and those around him safe. Safe. chapter 23, David hears word that there's a city that's under siege, under attack by the Philistines. And in the midst of a time where it would have been completely understandable if he would have just continued to hide out and protect himself, he recognized some of his brethren are in danger, so he takes his guys. After inquiring of the Lord, Lord, should I go help? And the Lord says, yeah, go help. He says, okay, well, some of the guys don't want to go. Lord, do you really want us to help? And the Lord's like, yeah, I really want you to go help. Okay, we got to go help. And he goes. And in the midst of that, there's a moment where Saul catches wind that David has gone to this place. And so we're supposed to feel the drama and the intrigue. Saul goes to chase after him. And when he chases after him, we're told in 1 Samuel chapter 23, towards the end of the chapter, we're told that Saul gets really, really close. In fact, they're only a hillside away from each other. The Bible calls it a mountain, but it's Israel, and these are mountains. You guys are from Montana, right? Are there mountains in Montana? You would be offended to hear an Israelite say, did you see that mountain? You would look at them and go, that feels like a molehill. So it's important for us to understand the geography of the land and know this. We sometimes see mountain and we would look at Mount McLaughlin and go, that's still a long ways off. No. It was just a hillside away. Just a hillside away. And it looks, according to the scriptures, it looks like Saul is about to overtake David and eliminate him once and for all. And we're supposed to understand if that happens, the plans of God have been thwarted and the enemy wins. But that's not the story of the Bible, ladies and gentlemen. The story of the Bible is even when it looks like it's going wrong, God works things out for good. Because when Saul is about to overtake David, he hears word that the Philistines have attacked in another area, and so he veers off and goes to fight another battle. In the meantime, David, quote, unquote, escapes. And we're told at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 23 that hillside that they were separated by ends up being called a rock of escape. So then you go to 1 Samuel chapter 24. David's still on the run. And he ends up at a place in En-Gedi. It's an area within Israel that's dry and arid and weary. Right now, in modern day times, it's kind of a recreational area. But back when David was there was no recreation. The only people that went to En-Gedi were people who needed to hide out because nobody would go out there because it was dry and weary. Yes, there were streams in the desert, so to speak, but it was a tough terrain. I've been there. When you go and you walk around the streams of En-Gedi in Israel, you have to take a lot of water. It gets really hot, and the hike is hard. You go up and down. However, the payoff is unbelievable because at any moment you can turn the corner on the trail, and it opens up to this huge pool of water that people from the surrounding communities are splashing and swimming in. In David's day, it was a tough area. It was an area that people went to hide out in. And there were caves there that allowed people to do so. So in 1 Samuel chapter 24, we read that David finds himself with his men in the dark recesses of another cave. And we're supposed to feel that this is it. Because I don't know if you ever been in the dark recesses in the very back of a cave? And there's nowhere else to go? The only way out is that way? You can't go that way? The only way out is that way, but that way is being blocked by the very people that are pursuing you to eliminate you from the face of the planet? This is where David arrives, in the very back recesses of another cave. Now, I don't know about you, but listen, David killed Goliath. Are you with me? And after that, he became a much respected and feared warrior. So I don't know about you, but within the narrative of David's run from Saul, if there was ever a moment where it would be understandable for David to pull out Goliath's sword and start swinging it around in the dark so as to protect himself. I think I pulled a rib yesterday and that really hurt. This would be the moment. But if you go back and you read 1 Samuel chapter 24, what you're going to read is that David refused to lift his hand against the Lord's anointed. What kind of trust in God does that require? David refused in the dark recesses of that cave when Saul and his soldiers are this far away. David refuses to lift his hands in self-preservation. And instead, he surrenders them to trusting in God. We're told in that moment, instead of taking the dagger that was in his hand and silently eliminating the threat to his life, you get the feel, you get the sense. He instead stealthily cuts off part of Saul's garment. In the confusion and the darkness of the cave, which I think is quite interesting if you consider like metaphors and feelings, Saul gets all turned around and doesn't find him. And he goes out of the cave. David follows shortly thereafter and yells to Saul, "Why are you persisting in this evil of trying to eliminate me? Look at what's in my hand. I could have taken you out, but I didn't. God wants something better from our lives." Saul responds by going, again, fake spirituality all over the place, but he responds by saying, "Oh, God, I'm so sorry. Far be it from me. I know you're going to be the king. Will you please make me a promise? Will you swear by an oath that you won't eliminate the rest of my family when you take the throne?" To which in your Bibles at the end of 1 Samuel chapter 24, I want you to take a pen or a pencil or a writing device, and I want you to write C. Mephibosheth. If you don't know how to spell it, just pull out your phone and Google it. I think it's Mephosheth. Because once you see that, you'll see that there was one. David, when he does come on the throne, he does seek out those who belong to Saul or Jonathan that he could show kindness to. David's on the run, and what we're supposed to understand and what we're trying to communicate, that while he's on the run, at every single turn, he had reason to give up on God and take matters into his own hand and trust his own ability to preserve himself, but he does not. Instead, we read about what he did. The first thing that we read is found in Psalm 34. If you look at Psalm 34, you can go ahead and turn there. You can read verses 1 through 9 with me. David, when he was on the run, desperate and starving, acting like a madman, he wrote these words, "I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul makes its boast in the Lord." Do you guys see the irony? That at the same time where gibberish was coming out of his mouth before the king of Gath, when he was acting like a madman, his heart was crying out truth. He says, "My soul makes its boast in the Lord. Let the humble hear and be glad. Oh, magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from all my fears. Those who look to him are radiant, and their faces shall never be ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him, and he delivers them. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good." By the way, he wrote this right after he ate the bread that was in the temple. Oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. Psalm 34, verses 1 through 9, is where we find from this whole overview the first principle in terms of trusting God in the midst of troubling and tough times. Number one, we have to stay humble. We have to stay humble. Now, if I were you, I'd be like, wait, I read the verses with you, and I didn't see the word humble. It's because we're sneaky like that. Psalm 34, verse 1, I will bless the Lord at all times. The Hebrew word for bless means to kneel. Are you with me? I think this is fascinating because I, like you, oftentimes read bless the Lord, and I feel like there's something for me to say. God, you're good. So good. Hallelujah. Anyone? I feel like it's verbal. I feel like it's just something we do. I feel like it's something that's easier to do with stringed instruments. Yes? But when we take a real closer look at the scriptures and we read, I will bless the Lord at all times, what David is saying is at a time where he was trying to trust God and he could have taken matters into his own hands. He could have stood up for himself. He's saying, I will kneel before the Lord at all times. Let me ask you this. If there is somebody that wants to eliminate you from the face of the planet, how vulnerable are you if you turn your back on them and you do this? There is a part of me, the junior high side of me, that's actually terrified that somebody's here that I didn't recognize from when I was an idiot in junior high. And at this moment, while I'm trying to make a point, you're going to come and whack me upside the head. The first principle, the first thing that we have to keep in mind as it relates to trusting God in the midst of tough times is we have to stay humble. How humble? We go low so that his name can be lifted high. But see, it's unique. It's a unique challenge because there's no time like a troubling time that makes us feel like a little puffed up and full of pride. And what I mean by that is makes us feel like we have no other choice but to take matters into our own hands and deal with our enemies our own way and then ask God to bless it or forgive it. See what I mean? But David uses different language. At a time when we would have understood him to take matters into his own hands, he says, I will bless the Lord at all times. I will kneel before the Lord, and when I kneel, my soul will make its boast in the Lord. Let the humble hear and be glad. Let those who are inclined to recognize the majestic, powerful sovereignty plans of God, let them hear what I'm saying and be glad. When David was on the run, he wrote Psalm 34. When he acted like a madman, he wrote Psalm 34. Not only was David willing to be humble, but he was willing to be humiliated in order to grow in his ability to trust God. That's the first thing we got to do. I saw the hands. You saw the hands. We all saw the hands. There are people in here who have said, communicated, even I might add courageously, in the midst of a world that judges everybody for everything, you lifted up your hand and said, I'm having a hard time. I'm guessing the last thing that you wanted to hear is, well, just stay humble. If it were me, I would want to hear like, well, here's plan A, B, C, and D, and if that fails, I've got E and F all lined up for you. That's not what you get here. What you get here is get down on your knees. Put yourself, take the posture of a person who is willing to trust God completely. Take the posture of a person who is willing before God and their enemies and their struggles and their problems and their pains. You take a vulnerable position and say, God, I'm counting on you, only you. I suggest when we do, even as David mentions, he shows himself faithful. The next thing that we learn from David in this process of having to trust God is found in Psalm number 57. You can turn there if you can really quickly. You can find verse 5. In verse 5, we read these words, Be exalted, O God, above the heavens. Let your glory be over all the earth. They, the enemies, is what David is speaking of. They set a net for my steps, and my soul was bowed down. Do you guys see that? See the connection? They set a net for my steps when my soul was bowed down. They dug a pit in my way, but they have fallen into it themselves. My heart is steadfast, O God, and my heart is steadfast. I will sing and I will make melody. Awake my glory, awake, O harp and lyre. I will awake the dawn. I will give thanks to you, O Lord. When he says awake my glory, don't forget David played the harp for Saul and he was very accomplished at it. And so he says, I will sing with, listen, Lord, give me the ability to take all the gifts you've given to me and give them back to you in songs of adoration. This is what he's saying. He says, I will give thanks to you, O Lord, among the peoples. I will sing praises to you among the nations, for your steadfast love is great to the heavens, and your faithfulness to the clouds. Be exalted, O God, above the waters. Let your glory be over all the earth. The next thing that we've got to do in the midst of tough times in order to trust the Lord is sing. Stay humble and keep singing. Now, some of you are like, well, Emma won't let me on the worship team. And if that's you and you have that attitude, I want you at the end of the service to come right here in the middle of this front row because I need to pray for you. We got to keep singing. We got to be a people who have a song in our heart and on our head, that just comes out. Maybe it comes out just internally, like, Hey, do you guys sing like that? You guys have that? I'm so sorry. This is church. We don't want to be right here. Not here. That's too much. Right here. Right? Maybe it's like that. Maybe it's just the reality. Maybe it's out loud. Maybe, like children, we're supposed to have a song in our heart that comes out in words we make up on the spot. You ever been around a 5-year-old that makes up songs? Woo! I would repeat the lyrics to you, but I can't remember them because they do not make sense. But maybe that's the reality. What happens when we sing praises to God? What happens when we sing or shout or make known in poetic ways the glory of God? You know what happens? Our faith changes. Our ability to trust. Yes? Our God is an awesome God. He reigns. I forgot the words, but some of you all didn't. Right? So you're thinking, well, that's why I don't sing. Because you know what happens when I try to make a praise song? I forget the words, and then I look the fool. It's not that bad. You just saw it happen. You can get over it. But when we sing, our heart changes. Why? Because we're singing of the glorious ways that God is, that he has shown us throughout his word, that we have seen among his people, and we remember in the testimony of our own hearts. Oh, I've been here before. And the last time I was here, God was faithful. So I'm going to go ahead and let his faithfulness become a song in my heart that makes its way out my mouth. Our God is an awesome God. He reigns. Listen, we're never going to record that and put it on a CD. Or on an MP3, or nobody's going to stream that. But it brought tears to my eyes. Why? Because we all remember in those moments, yeah, he really is awesome. And there are probably 100 different stories within this room that would prove how awesome he is. Ladies and gentlemen, if you want to build your trust in God, even in the midst of difficult days, you got to stay humble and you got to keep singing. Turn to Psalm 54, just a few pages back. Psalm 54. David wrote this in verses 1 through 7. He says, "Oh God, save me by your name and vindicate me by your might. Oh God," verse 2, "hear my prayer. Give ear to the words of my mouth. For strangers have risen against me. Ruthless men seek my life. They do not set God before themselves. Behold, God is my helper. The Lord is the upholder of my life. He will return the evil to my enemies. In your faithfulness, put an end to them. With a freewill offering, I will sacrifice to you. I will give thanks to your name, O Lord, for it is good. For he who has delivered me from trouble, and my eye has For he has delivered me from every trouble, and my eye has looked in triumph upon my enemies. The next thing that we do in the midst of tough times as it relates to continuing to trust God, not only do we have to keep kneeling, don't stop singing, but we also have to keep praying. Look at verse 2. Oh God, hear my prayer, give ear to the words of my mouth. And then he writes verse after verse after verse of how God was faithful to those prayers. You have to keep praying. Don't give up on talking to the one in whom you place your trust. In other places we read that he is the God who comes near. He is the God who always hears. He is the God who is aware, even down to the number of hairs on your head. He is aware. I'm not. There's a couple of guys in the room that looked at me like, he's also the God of genetics. I don't know why he gives some to others and none to I don't know. But I'm not going to look at anyone. The point I'm trying to make is no matter what is going on, he is aware of who you are, where you're at, and what you need. Don't stop praying. Last thing, we'll end with this. Psalm 63 real quick. Psalm 63 verses 1 through 4. This is a psalm of David when he was in the wilderness of Judah. In other words, when he was on the run from Saul in Gedi. In other words, right around the time he was hiding in the cave. In other words, right around the time when he could have taken Saul's life, but he didn't. Here's what he says. He says, "O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water." Don't forget where he was. He goes on in verse 2 and he says, "So I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and your glory. Because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I will bless you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift up my hands." The last thing that I would leave you with in terms of trying to do what you can to trust God in the midst of tough times is keep kneeling, don't stop singing, don't ever stop praying, and keep your hands lifted high. So here's the thing. He says, I will bless you as long as I live, and in your name I will lift up my hands. It's no surprise to me, and it's not lost on me at all, that David wrote this right around the time that he spared Saul's life in that cave in En-Gedi. Instead of lifting up his hands in self-preservation, he lifts them, he uses them for God's glory. I mean, that's a strong word for us. If you're hearing it, you got to understand what's being said. What's being said is this. In the midst of difficult days and troubling times, when you feel like you've got to take care of yourself because no one else will, I'm trying to do my best fighting thing. All of you know in this moment, that guy fighting like this would get beat up. That's the point. Instead of doing that, or holding out your hands to be used in revenge, or holding out your hands to be used for self-preservation, what David says is, in your name, I will lift my hands on high. Ladies and gentlemen, if our hands are busy being raised, used for the glory of God, then we won't have time for us to manhandle the situations around us and make more of a mess than we're already in.